Hi, my name is Caitlin Calogera. I'm the president of a tour of her own. We are the first tourism company in Washington, D.C. to focus exclusively on women's history. I'm also the author of this guidebook, 111 Places in Women's History that you must not miss in Washington, D.C. And I'm joined here today with my co-author and vice president of education in Tour of Her Own, Rebecca Grawl, and Rob from TripHacks, who is well known in Washington, D.C., and has agreed to host us today on his very special podcast. So today's program is a virtual salon where you can watch the presentation and then you can also follow up and listen to the podcast later on and support TripHacks. So with that said, I'm going to pass this on to Rob, who will moderate the conversation.
Okay, thank you, Caitlin, and thank you for allowing me to interview you about your fantastic book and to lead this conversation. And I'm really excited to have you both join me for the conversation today. And I'm really excited to go in depth about this topic because it's one that, as a tour guide, I feel like I should know more about women's history, especially on the National Mall. And thanks to your book, I do now. I've given tours of the monuments and memorials for 9 years. I've probably given the tour over 1,000 times at this point. And the monuments and memorials, they're great and they're amazing. And they're what millions of people come to Washington, D.C. every year to experience. And they're also primarily monuments to the famous men in history. Let's be honest about that. And to wars, which men historically have played a different role in than women in history. So I am really grateful for your book because it's not just a guidebook in the traditional sense. It's, to me, a storybook. And the stories are what are incredibly interesting. And they helped me learn about places that I've seen before, but I didn't know much about, or I knew a little bit about, and now I know a lot more about them. And the book gave me the inspiration to seek out places that I never even knew existed. So one thing I will say about the book is that I picked it up and I read it straight through. And only once I flipped to the final page, after chapter 111, I got to the map. And the map is fantastic. And it shows the location of all of the sites that are included in the book. Are we doing a little visual there? So Caitlin's pointing that out. And so if you're only partially way through the book, you might want to flip back to the end of the book and check out the map. Great resource. For the agenda for this episode, I kind of mentally split the conversation into 3 sections. So the first is women's history sites and stories that people might already know about. The second is women's history sites and stories that people might not know about, or what I like to call the hidden gems, because people love the hidden gems. And finally, I noticed that the book actually has quite a few stories based in hotels. And I thought that would be a really great opportunity to talk about some places where visitors might like to stay when they visit, if they're really into women's history and they want an experience that's more than just your standard Hampton Inn, Homewood Suites kind of general corporate hotel experience. And also just for the purpose of this discussion, I'm considering the National Mall to be anything near the monuments, the museums, the Capitol, the White House, and all the way up to the Supreme Court and the Library of Congress. So this is technically not the definition of the National Mall, at least according to the National Park Service, but I know it's where a lot of visitors spend their time when they come. And so I thought it was appropriate for this episode. So I want to start by talking about a site that I feel like is pretty well known, or at least it is to me, because it's one of the first stops on my monuments tour. And it's to a very well-known woman, and that is Eleanor Roosevelt and the Eleanor Roosevelt statue at the FDR Memorial. And what I thought was interesting in the book is that you focused on her articles or her op-eds, even though there's a million different stories you can tell about Eleanor Roosevelt. So I'm curious why you chose that. And if you could talk a little bit about the story about how Eleanor wound up in this presidential memorial.
I think everybody knows Eleanor Roosevelt to some degree, right? We recognize her as a first lady. We often quote her, and she definitely had a presence in the White House that is a legacy. As I was thinking about how to present her in this book and put it in terms of places and history, it occurred to me that Eleanor Roosevelt was a historian, and she documented so much of what was happening at the time of the Roosevelt administration. And when we think about visibility and what it means to have representation, I think one of the reasons why we're so familiar with Eleanor Roosevelt is because she wrote these columns called My Day nearly every single day for decades. And she was connected to the people in that way. So as a historian, I wanted to highlight another woman that was telling all history and documenting it. And then it became, well, what did she write about? Were there any specific moments that would connect with the memorial? And it occurred to me, like, what did she write when FDR had passed away? Because now you're not just telling the story of a first lady, you're telling the story of a grieving wife. You're telling the story of a very personal moment, and just like an inside look into how she might have been dealing with that. And so if you read the book, you'll notice she actually took a few days off from writing for the first time in history. And then when she came back, she had these really intentional words about what she wanted her legacy, what she wanted FDR's legacy to be, what she felt like he left in this world for all of us. And so when you walk through that memorial, FDR's presence is very known, and it's interpretive in that we can try to make sense of his impact on the world. But I wrote that as a way of saying, here's a woman, she documented not only public history, but personal history as well. And let's think for a moment, being in her shoes and what it meant for her to lose her husband, to lose a member of her family, and then show up to the public and share those feelings with us. So that's where I started with it. And then just one more little kicker is I really wanted to make a connection with her and Mary McLeod Bethune, because they had a wonderful relationship, and they're both the only two outdoor memorials of American women. So in Washington, D.C. So it felt like synergy to put both of them in there together in one way or another.
I'm really glad Kaitlin mentioned that, because I was going to jump in and say one of the things I love about the book, and one thing that happened both with purpose, but also often spontaneously as we were developing our chapters and sharing them and sort of building the book, is how quickly the connections between sites were built. And so particularly as a tour guide, especially if you're working with students or you're with a group for a long period of time, you're always trying to find those connections and kind of build those layers. And I loved how easy it was with this book to find those points of intersection and those points where one site tells a story of another site, tells a story of another site. And the Eleanor Roosevelt chapter is a great example of that, because Eleanor and Mary McLeod Bethune have those two American women statues on public land in DC. So if you're going to go find the statues of women, those are probably the two you're going to find, and they actually have an incredible connection. So I encourage those that are reading through the book, whether you're doing it chronologically, whether you're reading it alphabetically, whether you're opening the map and jumping around, definitely look for those connections and intersections, because there's quite a lot, both intentional and sort of unintentionally, that came up as we worked on it.
And I did note that you mentioned that connection in the book. So it's definitely in there. What I think is really fascinating, and the reason I like the book, and also the reason why when you come to Washington, D.C., there isn't just a tour of the monuments or a tour of the National Mall, is because when I give the tour and I get to the statue of Eleanor Roosevelt, I talk about Eleanor Roosevelt, the first delegate to the United Nations, because that's what it says on the wall. There's literally a United Nations logo behind her. And so to me, that is the story, but that's very different from the story you just told. And so I think that that's fascinating, and they're both great stories, and they both show a different side of Eleanor in a way that you might not get if you only did one or the other, or if you're just kind of wandering around on your own.
Yeah, I just want to add one more thing about this chapter. I encourage all of our readers to read the tips as well. So the tips are logistics, but they also offer insight to a relevant place, so thematically or geographically. This particular tip for Eleanor Roosevelt is highlighting the final resting place of Cokie Roberts, who is buried in Congressional Cemetery. Now, we have a Congressional Cemetery chapter that highlights Anne Royale, but we wanted to include Cokie Roberts. And so I want just people to recognize the connection even between Eleanor Roosevelt and Cokie Roberts being journalists and writers and women who really left us with publications and words to reflect back on history with.
Okay, so I think you said that there are 2 statues of women in Washington, D.C. and
On
I think
public land, American
public
women.
land. And those are specific women, right? So Eleanor Roosevelt and Mary
McLeod Bethune.
McLeod Bethune. And another statue that is on my monuments tour as well is not to a specific woman, but to the women who served in the Vietnam War. And so this is the Vietnam Women's Memorial. And I find the story behind this fascinating because when you take the tour, you learn that the Vietnam Memorial opened in 1982, or at least the wall opened in 1982. And then you learned that the Vietnam Women's Memorial opened in 1993. And the big question is, well, why the gap in time? Why did it take so long to add what nowadays seems like an obvious addition, an obvious part of the memorial? Why did it take 11 extra years to add that on?
Yeah, the Vietnam Women's Memorial, to be direct, is one that people are fairly familiar with. It is right there in the heart of the memorials. So we were looking for the story below the surface. And I found this woman, Diane Carlson Evans. And looking back, I don't know how to even say this, but like, you can't tell the story of this memorial without mentioning her. She's so influential and significant in this decade-long fight to secure this memorial, and her story is embedded in that bronze sculpture that you see. Now, we also mentioned Glenna Goodacre, who's the sculptor and the artist, and of course her story is relevant as well. I think one of the things that Becca and I and the whole team at A Tour of Her Own tries to do is pull a little bit away from these allegorical figures. So women that don't actually have a proper identity. In the Vietnam Women's Memorial, we talk about hope and faith and charity, and those are all beautiful, and there's a time and a place for that. But we really wanted to highlight real women that are doing the work behind the scenes. And so for me, the Vietnam Women's Memorial is about, Diane Carlson Evans, and I hope that people will start to recognize that.
It always pains me a little bit when I lead a tour, and a lot of the customers who come on a tour with me, they've been to Washington, D.C. before. Now, it might have been when they were in 8th grade, or it might have been on a family road trip when they were a child. But one thing that a lot of them say is, I vividly remember the Vietnam War Memorial, but I don't think I saw the Women's Memorial. And I suspect the reason is because when you're coming out of the Vietnam Memorial and you're walking down that path back towards the reflecting pool, if you turn left, you're going to miss it. And if you turn right, you might still miss it if you're not paying a lot of attention. And so it's one of those things where even though it's right there, it's very much in the center of the monuments and memorials sphere of Washington, D.C. It's one that a lot of people still somehow, I feel like, managed to miss.
And even if you do, I think, walk by it, there's not a ton of context presented with the memorial independently. And this is obviously why we're all such advocates for going with a tour guide, booking a tour, having someone knowledgeable share these sites with you. Because if you're on your own, you might see this beautiful work of art and this beautiful sculpture, and you can see the beauty of it, but you're not going to see anything about Diane Carlson Evans. You're not going to see information, in-depth information about the thousands of women who went abroad, volunteers, women who chose to go and be a part of this war. You're not going to hear about all the women through the Red Cross who are going to provide emotional and recreational sort of support for the men serving in the war. So even if you see this beautiful memorial, that context isn't well represented in signage or in any sort of didactic material on the National Mall. And that's, I think, a big part of why we are such advocates for what we do in our industry, is we can help bring those stories to light that you literally will not be able to find unless you think to stand there and start Googling and start researching while you're on the site. And who does that on vacation, right?
Exactly.
I mean, some of us do, but
tour guides do that on
the
vacation.
average traveler.
Now, the next story I want to talk about, today is January 20th, the day we're recording this. A lot of people probably will listen to this a little bit later. And so today is exactly 2 months before the start of the National Cherry Blossom Festival, one of my favorite times in DC, as I'm sure many of yours as well. And I have told the story of the cherry blossoms so many times that I feel like I lost touch of the fact that one of the main players, there's really two main women who brought the cherry blossoms to Washington, D.C., and one of them gets very little formal credit. And unless you have a tour guide telling you her story, you might not know about it. So can you introduce her and talk about the site of the first planting of the cherry trees on the tidal basin and why she's not there?
When we were breaking down the sites in this book, I was like adamant that we do the cherry blossoms because Eliza Skidmore is a woman that I talk about extensively on my tidal basin tours and my cherry blossom tours. And it is such a shame, and really, I think, a huge gap that's missing when we talk about the cherry blossoms, that there's no formal acknowledgement of her anywhere on any plaque or signage around the tidal basin. But Eliza Skidmore is really the woman that sets us on the path to get the cherry blossoms. And she is a fascinating woman in her own right. She was a world traveler. She was a writer, an explorer. Her brother was a diplomat. And so Eliza Skidmore never marries. She kind of uses her brother's career as an opportunity to go places that the average woman in the late 19th century wasn't able to go. She would be the first woman to sit on the board of the National Geographic Society. And starting in 1885, she begins kind of this one-woman campaign to really bring Japanese cherry blossoms to Washington, D.C. And she's just tenacious about it. She writes letter after letter after letter. She's a smart, connected society woman. And yet, no matter how hard she tries, she's just ignored until 1909. When the Tafts go to the White House. Helen Nellie Taft, who's one of my all-time most favorite first ladies. We talk about her on my First Ladies tour with TOHO. She gets into the White House and she gets one of these letters that Eliza's been writing to everybody saying, hey, we should do this. And Helen Taft immediately sees an opportunity for a fantastic public beautification project. She sees an opportunity for cross-cultural connection. And it's really once Taft and Skidmore are connected that from 1909, it's only really 3 years later when we actually get the cherry blossoms that we see and enjoy today. And Eliza Skidmore was the only private citizen recorded to be there when the first cherry blossoms were planted. She would continue to really be an advocate for their preservation for the rest of her life. And yet when you go today and you go to that site where those first trees are planted, there's just no mention of her at all. And it was just so important to me that we use a chapter in this book to tell her story. And I mean, I could have written a whole book on Eliza. I could have written a whole book on Helen Taft, but I really wanted to be sure that that cherry blossom story highlights, because I mean, that's one of the number one things that brings people to Washington, D.C. is to go see these beautiful trees. And they're there because of the tenacity of one woman.
And so if you haven't been over there, the site of the first planting of the cherry trees is over near where the the Japanese lantern is now. And I've been there many times and I've seen that plaque, and I guess I just never read it closely enough to realize that Eliza Skidmore's name is not included on there. So I'm curious if you know, or if you don't know, if you wish to speculate, people who were around 100 years ago or a little over 100 years ago, who did they think was responsible for bringing the cherry trees to Washington, D.C.? Did they think it was purely First Lady Taft, or did they think that
probably a man? They just assumed a man did it. Yeah.
You know, and it's one of those, I think, a little bit of a tricky sitch, right? Because the whole gifting from Japan, it's diplomatic. There is a huge diplomatic element. So you want to pay tribute to the nation that has gifted us this trees. And that's a lot of what the signage kind of indicates, this wonderful kind of international brethren feeling, which is lovely. but it really just sort of ignores that there was somebody for 25 years really pushing to bring these trees there. And someday I think TOHO would really love to push the drive of some sort of marker or memorial to Eliza Skidmore so that her story can be better recognized and acknowledged by visitors to those beautiful trees.
That would be something if you could make it happen. Definitely something to brag about. Now, those are some of the stories that I put into my mental category of sites and stories that people might already know about. And if you don't, it's okay. That's why the book exists. But the next category of stories are things that I bookmarked as sites and stories that people might not know about. Now, I will say folks tuned in live right now probably know about many of these. Folks who are listening on the podcast might not, and that's okay if you don't. But the first one I feel like is really important, and it's one that I, until recently, was kind of woefully ignorant about. So I was hoping you could explain what this is and why it exists, and that is the Belmont Paul National Monument near the Capitol, so kind of on the edge of what I consider the National Mall. But it's an important one. So what can you tell us about it?
Yeah, when we were kind of breaking out the book too, we made lists of like sites that we were automatically like, these are definitely going to be on there. And Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument, which is the official title, was a must include for us because I think so much of the women's history we do talk about and learn is wrapped up around the suffrage movement and the fight for the 19th Amendment. And this building was the headquarters of the National Women's Party. This was the organization that was the primary sort of driver behind that final push for the passage and ratification of the 19th Amendment. In the chapter specifically, we really used this as an opportunity to talk about Alice Paul, who had been part of NASA previously, which was another women's suffrage organization. Alice Paul is really kind of the driving force behind the 1913 suffrage parade, which is the first major political demonstration to take place in Washington, D.C. She and Lucy Burns are eventually going to found the National Women's Party to be this sort of more radical, more aggressive wing of the fight for suffrage. And then after the passage of the 19th Amendment, the thing I love most about Alice Paul is she's not like, great, women have the vote, check, we're good, everybody go home. Alice is like, now the real work begins. Getting the vote for Alice was the beginning of the story, not the end. And she immediately is going to launch into what will occupy the rest of her life, which is to fight for the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment. And a lot of the work for the ERA is done in this building on Capitol Hill. They're going to move the National Women's Party headquarters there to this beautiful historic house that's just a block from the Supreme Court. So it really is right in the core of kind of federal Capitol Hill. And she is going to live there until the 1970s. She is going to literally spend the last 50 years of her life advocating for the ERA, but also just for women to be included in legislation, in sort of civil rights legislation and equality. We mentioned the United Nations earlier with Eleanor Roosevelt. When the United Nations is developing and creating the founding documents that will make the UN, it's Alice advocating to make sure women are included as a protected class and that women's equality and equity is part of the vision of the United Nations. So it's an incredible historic site. The site certainly focuses on the women's suffrage story, which is so key. But Alice lived in this house and worked in this house for really like the last 45 to 50 years of her life. And so Alice's story really comes alive there. President Obama is the one who designates it a national monument in 2016. So it's a really new site. If you're a big national park enthusiast, which I know a lot of DC visitors are, and you love your park passport, you love collecting your ranger badges, there's a special suffrage badge that you can get there at the Belmont Paul House. It's been closed because of COVID, but it should hopefully reopen this year. And it's one that I definitely encourage people to make time to see because it just tells such an important story.
And it's a little bit different. It's called a national monument, but it's not like going to the Washington Monument or to the Lincoln Memorial. So can you just give folks a sense of when you visit, what kind of experience do you get when you go there? Assuming it's open, post COVID or whatnot.
Yeah, it's a historic house. It's more like a national park site, similar to like Cedar Hill, which is Frederick Douglass's home in Anacostia, and which we definitely mention as a tip. Frederick Douglass, such an outspoken advocate for women's suffrage in his lifetime. So when you visit the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument, you will typically go and there are park rangers there, just like you might see out on the National Mall. What makes these park rangers unique is to be here at the Belmont Paul. You do a special series of trainings. These are rangers that have chosen to be at this site as opposed to rotating through a series of DC sites. So they're very strong advocates for telling women's history and sharing these stories. And you literally get to go into the rooms where these women were writing letters to congressmen and where they were making banners and making signs, and you can see the banners they carried in the 1913 march, and you can see the newspapers and the pamphlets and the letters that they created, and you're doing it all within this house that has stood on Capitol Hill since the very beginning of the 19th century. So it's a really sort of remarkable layer of history that sort of gets presented there.
So in a way, it's a bit of a museum monument hybrid, maybe like a very small museum. You could think of it that way when you're visiting. Now, a very short walk away, just down the street, is the Supreme Court. And typically, historically, when people have asked me, hey, should I visit the Supreme Court? My advice has been, well, are you a lawyer? Are you a law student? Are you really into the law? And if the answer is yes, then yeah, go for it. And if not, then maybe it's not going to be top of your list. And once I read the book, I thought maybe I should change that advice to say, hey, are you really into the women of the Supreme Court? And if yes, maybe you should go check it out, because there is a portrait of Sandra Day O'Connor that is there. And I will admit, I didn't know much about Sandra Day O'Connor other than that she was the first woman on the Supreme Court. And that's pretty much all I knew about her until I read the book, of course. And so what else can we learn about her that's important, especially when you're visiting DC?
Yeah, I'd love to touch on what's inside the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor's life, and also how we approach this chapter. I think all three are important. There is a beautiful portrait of Justice O'Connor hanging in the Supreme Court right on the main floor that visitors can see. It's pretty accessible. But behind that, there's almost an entire exhibit for her as well that is a bit hidden. If you're just going in and out of the Supreme Court, you could miss it. So you really have to go in there with the intention of finding this. There's a bust of her head. There's all different photos of her with various presidents and dignitaries. It's quite remarkable. And I think it is one of the places in the city that does show respect to women's history in a very tangible way. So I would encourage people to go and explore that. To your point, I also did not know much about Justice O'Connor. And, you know, she was a first, and that's an extraordinary accomplishment. But also when we share women's history, we're always kind of questioning how much emphasis we want to put on the first, right? Because at that point, there were several other women who had followed in her footsteps. And, you know, just because you're the first doesn't mean you might have the biggest legacy, or you might not have accomplished so much. Like there's so many factors, right? In this situation, I think her legacy as being the first really is something that all judges and justices and American people should look back on and reflect with. If you read the chapter, there's a few different things in there. I started off being very direct with statistics and numbers to kind of start grounded, right? To give this a level of perspective as to what it meant to be the first. So let me just give you a few numbers here. Prior to Justice O'Connor being confirmed to the court, we as a country went through 191 years with all men serving on the court, 191 consecutive years. And in that time, we saw 101 male justices. So she's really stepping into a system here and showing up in a way that, of course, there's going to be a lot of weight to carry with that and responsibility. While it's a great accomplishment for her to serve, and as well as the other female justices to follow, you'd have to write this chapter and recognize how hard it was for her to get there. And I think that this story is often told through Ruth Bader Ginsburg's perspective, But Sandra Day O'Connor had gone through the same exact thing. And at this time, another statistic I put in here was just 2% of students in law school were women. And when they were coming out, the discrimination was unbelievable. I mean, and blatant, like, we're not going to hire you because you're a woman and you need to go take care of the kids. You want to make money, go sell baked goods. Like, that is what we're talking about. So it's the persistence and the perseverance that I think is so remarkable from her, like, a career judicial perspective, right? But when I think about Supreme Court justices, right, it's like they're in a black robe, it's very official, this is the highest court of the land, it's a lifetime term. I mean, this is no joke, right? And what we try to do with these stories is make it approachable. So I didn't want Sandra Day O'Connor to be someone that was distant from us. I really wanted her to be a relatable character, because as I was reading her, I was like, I didn't know this. Oh my gosh, she's so cool. How neat. And I wanted the reader to feel that. So as you go deeper into the conversation, into the chapter, there's a few fun little like ditties about her. You know, for one is, she's a mother. She's raising children. She had to take time off from work to bring up her kids and then make the decision to go back, which is something that we are still working with in society and trying to figure out. And then I found this one kicker that, like, you have to put in the chapter, right? And it's this reference to Julia Childs and how the justice used to use her recipes to cook. And we also have a chapter about Julia Child. So that just seemed really, really relevant. And when we were writing this chapter, you know, we wanted to kind of do an overview of different Supreme Court justices, or we wanted to just really paint it in a way that felt relatable and like you kind of understood what the position was. And Justice O'Connor was really the best way to highlight that and share that message.
It's worth saying that Ruth Bader Ginsburg is included in the book as well. It's not a National Mall site, so we're not going to talk about it today. But I'm glad you included Sandra Day O'Connor, because I'm afraid to say, quite ignorant about her and fascinated to learn about her from the book. And also that she was confirmed by the Senate with a 99-0 vote. I don't know who abstained, but that is something that in 2022, getting 99 senators to agree on anything seems impossible.
Yeah.
Now, I want to go to the other side of the Capitol and go to the U.S. Botanic Gardens. Now, prior to reading the book and changing the way I think about these sites, if someone had asked me, hey, are there any monuments to first ladies? I might have said, well, there's the Eleanor Roosevelt statue, and that's sort of a monument to a first lady, amongst other things that she did. And I would have considered the First Lady's garden at the Botanic Gardens just part of the Botanic Gardens. But I think now when people ask me that question, I'm going to say, yes, there is a monument to the First Ladies, and it's at the U.S. Botanic Gardens. I'm going to change my own framing on that. So what is this water garden at the Botanic Gardens, and how did it wind up there?
And I'll be honest, when I started this book, I had no idea that there was a First Lady's water garden. I've been to the United States Botanical Gardens, I've walked the grounds, I've been there, and it just never registered to me that there was a designated space within the Botanical Gardens that was specific to First Ladies. That was something that Kaitlin brought to my attention, and that another guide had brought to my attention. But it is, people do ask all the time, like, where are First Ladies honored? And this is one of the ways. So I think the story of this is kind of remarkable. In 1994, 6 of the 7 living First Ladies got together. So we're talking about Lady Bird Johnson and Rosalind Carter and Betty Ford and Barbara Bush and Hillary Clinton and Nancy Reagan. The only reason Jackie Kennedy Onassis isn't there is she's too ill to attend, but she signs off in support of this endeavor. But these living First Ladies get together and they attend an event to start to fundraise for an element of the Botanical Gardens that acknowledges the First Ladies. And we do an entire tour at TOHO on the First Ladies. It's fascinating when you really think about what a First Lady is. Lady Bird Johnson says that a First Lady is an unpaid public official elected by a constituent of one, her husband, right? Michelle Obama described it as being in sort of this sidecar to history, like you're along for the ride, but you're not driving the vehicle. You come into this role, there's usually an incredible amount of public scrutiny, and yet you are not being paid for your work, but you're expected to to do something. And no matter what you do, you're sort of facing a lot of criticism and I think judgment on what a first lady is or isn't. And so for all of these women to come together and sort of say, we think we should be acknowledged in some way, I think that's really, really special. Now that's 1994. It's going to take about 12 years for this to actually be fundraised, developed, and created. It's a great example of a public site that honors women's history and their legacy. But again, there's not a lot of contextualization. It's a beautiful public space. The garden itself is inspired by Martha Washington's quilting pattern. So the quilt pattern that Martha Washington regularly utilized. And you can see examples of this at Mount Vernon. They have a couple of Martha's quilts, as does Tudor Place actually has a quilt that was done by Martha Washington, which is also in the book in Georgetown. But if you walk through, it's not as though there's a listing of first ladies. It's not as though there's stories of these first ladies presented, but I do appreciate that it's an acknowledgement that there is a series of women in our history that have played this really important, pivotal public role that somehow has no definition in our Constitution and does not exist in any official way, and yet we immediately recognize as a key public figure. So it's really kind of a beautiful space, and I encourage people to visit the Botanical Gardens, but hopefully you'll walk away wanting to know more about the women that it sort of represents. And I would personally love to see more representation of our first ladies in public spaces in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, that's one thing that I often tell people, especially when I'm talking about Eleanor Roosevelt, that absolutely blows their mind, is that the Constitution doesn't talk about a first lady. It doesn't require a first lady. We've had a president who was unmarried. We had a president who was widowed, and they found a woman to fill in that role. But there could be no first lady or first gentleman or whatever title we want to choose. And that would be constitutionally and legally just fine. And the fact that we have kind of carved this out and said culturally we have to have this is extremely interesting to me. And whenever folks ask about a monument to first ladies, this is definitely going to be on my list from now on. One more exhibit that I want to chat about is in one of my favorite museums, the American History Museum, and it is quite honestly front and center, and many people see it because it's right there. I don't know if a lot of people really take the time to study it or learn about it, and so I want to make sure that we talk about it so that when people do go to the American History Museum, they're aware of the context. And of course, this is the Star-Spangled Banner, one of, if not the most famous flags in U.S. history. So how did it come to be, and how did it wind up front and center at the American History Museum?
So I will say that while one of the things we often talk about in TOHO is a lack of representation of women in outdoor public spaces, memorials, and monuments, I do feel like our museums in Washington, D.C. are a really great resource for people who are really looking for women's history or want to start a journey of discovering more about women's contributions to our history, because I think and we talk about a lot of museums in the book, but I think especially the Smithsonian Institution has done excellent work in integrating and including women's stories throughout their exhibits. So it was kind of hard to just pick one woman and one thing to talk about at the National Museum of American History. I think a lot of people might have done Julia Child and her kitchen, which is so iconic there, but I wanted to do something that was related to what is probably one of the most visited pieces at the museum, which is the Star-Spangled Banner. This is the flag that flies at Fort McHenry. This is the flag that inspires Francis Scott Key to write his poem, which becomes our national anthem. What people may not realize is that flag was made by a woman, as most flags in our nation's history were. Flag making, like a lot of other sort of sewing, woven arts, were done by women. And so that flag was made by a woman in Maryland named Mary Pickersgill. George Armistead, who's sort of the head of Fort McHenry, wants this garrison flag. He wants this giant flag that he's going to fly at Fort McHenry. We're in the middle of this big fight against England, our second war with England. And so he goes to local seamstress Mary Pickersgill and he says, okay, I need this flag. It's going to be huge, and I need you to make it fast. So she has to make this flag in about 6 weeks, which is pretty quick. She is paid a pretty princely sum. She's paid somewhere in the ballpark of like $400, which at that time was more than the average person made in a year. So she is given a significant financial incentive to get this done. So this is kind of a life changer for Mary Pickersgill to get this commission. because financially it kind of sets her up for life. What I love about the story is, she's making this flag. This flag at the time that she's making it is 400 yards of fabric. It weighs 50 pounds and it's huge, right? It's like almost 40 feet by 40 feet. She lives in a home that's like 20 feet by 20 feet. So how are you going to make a flag that's twice as big as your house? She has to move to sort of the local tavern, the local pub, and that's where she really completes the work. And she doesn't do it alone. She has help from local women to assist her in this. And it's just sort of amazing because when you see the flag today, it's sort of installed, laid out in this super well preserved kind of museum environment. And you don't think about how big and heavy it must have been and how physical that labor was when she was literally sewing these stars that are, when you look at it, you don't think the stars are that big, but the stars are like bigger than your hand. They're huge. And so I just think about what an incredible physical process she went through to create what is now the inspiration to the song that we sing at every national event, that we sing at every sporting event. And it all sort of began with this woman who just saw an opportunity to make some dough that she needed and who was just kind of trying desperately to get this done in 6 weeks. So I really love Mary Pickersgill. And if you visit this exhibit, everybody sort of sees the flag, and once they see the flag, they kind of leave. But there is a nice little section about Mary Pickersgill that has a portrait of her, a picture of her. There's examples of the kind of sewing materials she would have used, and there is a nice representation of her in this exhibit. So I do applaud Smithsonian, not just for this, but really across the board, the work they do in telling women's stories in their spaces.
And if you ever get a chance to go to Baltimore, a little companion to the museum exhibit is to go to her actual house, which is now a historic site. And that will probably even more give you a perspective on how on earth did they do this giant flag in this tiny house. Of course, they had to finish it outside the house at a local brewery because they didn't have enough room. But that's a great companion if you make it up to Baltimore on a DC or East Coast trip. Okay, I want to turn to the last category of Washington, D.C. sites. And those are the hotels with women's history. Now, just because of time, I just want to say there are 4 of them in the book, and they are the Willard Hotel, the Hotel Zena, the Tabard Inn, and the Mansion on O. And they all have their own unique stories and history. But the one that caught my attention was the Hotel Zena. And this is a new hotel. It's not a new building. So if you've been to Washington, D.C. before, this was previously the Kimpton Donovan House Hotel. It is on 14th Street. And a few years ago, Kimpton, they sold off some of their hotels, including some in the D.C. area, to other companies. And so it was renovated and rebranded into the Hotel Zena. And it is specifically themed as a women's history or a women's history hotel. So I have actually not been in it yet because it opened during COVID, which is very unfortunate, but I know you have because you've done some events there. So what's it like inside, and what can people expect when they stay there for a few nights or a week?
It's really fun. It's part hotel, part museum, part experience. It has all the, general hotel stuff. You got food, you got drinks, you got rooms, but you can also just kind of pop in there and explore. So I want to talk about it from 2 perspectives. One, it's also accessible for people with disabilities, which I think is really important to note. And it also is dog friendly. So if you are coming to DC and those are things you are, looking for, Hotel Zena is also very accessible in that way. When you walk in, it's really fun. You go to the front desk, and the whole front desk is made of this glass case with high heels inside, all colorful high heels, which is just something that is fun and fashionable and, has lots of history with women for sure. Not to say that, anybody can wear high heels, but it does tend to be traditionally female forward. And you really just, the walls are covered with artwork commissioned by local artists. Some that come to mind are Maggie O and Rose Hoffa, but also international artists as well. And the highlight, probably what they're most known for, is this huge portrait of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And as you walk in there, I mean, oh my gosh, you're like taken back by it because it's so exceptional. And the real highlight is as you get closer, you realize that this Ruth Bader Ginsburg portrait is made of tampons. Made of tampons. So very creative, definitely a site worth seeing. The hotel is basically created to be one big place to go and get your Instagram posts. You know, you get selfies and just fun pictures. So that's the basic setup of it. But I want to go back to this point of, you know, the hotel is the place, but the story is about the woman behind the hotel. And whenever we could, we always tried to just interview the people that were closest to the places. And I had the great opportunity of getting on the phone with the hotel designer, Andrea Sheehan of Dawson Design Associates. And she was very intentional about speaking with me because she wanted the hotel to be represented properly. And when speaking to her, I learned about a lot of what inspired her to design a female themed hotel. And, you know, we talked about big events. We talked about the Women's March. We talked about Me Too era and Time's Up and equal pay. And even going beyond that, you know, the significance of the Equal Rights Amendment and how we just have to bring these historical moments into our mainstream and into our culture. So there's no shortage of stories and women being represented here. And I think really Hotel Zena should be a stop on everybody's tour.
I'll just mention about Hotel Zena too. One of my favorite things is they have this incredible rooftop bar where you have the pool on the roof and there's a bar up there. And you get this great view, but it's named for Hedy Lamarr, which we didn't get a chance to shout out in the book, simply because they had sort of launched that and we'd already sort of done so much in the chapter. But I really love that sort of commitment that Hotel Zena has to women's history at every single level. So the bar is named for Hedy Lamarr, this woman who's famous for being an actress, but also was an incredible inventor and sort of technological genius that sort of gives us what is Wi-Fi today. She also, when you go to Hedy's bar up top, all the drinks are inspired by Hedy Lamarr. Specifically, there's great information in their menu about Hedy and that information. They do that across the board. So I really love that when you go there, you're getting this wonderful DC hotel experience. You're getting this great rooftop view and you're getting all of that, but you're also just getting women's history in a way that's accessible and fun and something that you can really digest and connect to. And that's something we're a really big advocate for, is making history accessible and making it fun.
And generally speaking, a lot of hotels in Washington, D.C. are, to be completely honest, a bit bland. They're like corporate hotels. They're where you come for a conference, a convention, and that's fine. We're not Las Vegas. You know, in Las Vegas, every single hotel is themed. And it would be weird if we had hotels in DC themed to a circus or Hollywood or whatever. But I feel like this is actually the perfect theme for a DC hotel if you're going to have a themed hotel in DC. And there is a photo of the Ruth Bader Ginsburg portrait in the book, but I would not have known just looking at the photo. You have to go, and this is a good plug for why you can't just get this book and read it and say, okay, I'm done. You have to read the book and then you have to go to all 111 places and see them in person, because there will be things you see in person that you don't get from text and that you don't get from pictures. And that's not to say that the text and the pictures aren't amazing, but you have to experience things with your own senses sometimes to really appreciate them.
And with a licensed professional tour guide to make it even better.
100%. Now, for the live audience, I know we wanted to save some time for Q&A. I feel like this is a great audience, and I feel like we're going to get some good questions. So I suppose you could go ahead and start putting those in the chat now if you would like, or we can let folks unmute themselves if they would like. But in the meantime, I want to wrap up for my podcast outro and say thank you to Kaitlin and Becca for joining me for this conversation. And we've talked all about your book. And now we need to know, aside from Amazon, because we don't want to buy it from Amazon, where can people buy this book?
Yeah, we're going to encourage people to go to your local bookshop, any of them in Washington, D.C. Many of them are carrying it. If not, you can always ask them to stock up their shelves with 111 places in women's history that you must not miss in Washington, D.C. So support local business. Please go to the local businesses that are mentioned in the book, have drinks there, eat there, and help support the sustainability of our wonderful nation's capital. Thank you.
Do you have a favorite local bookstore, either of you?
We love them all equally.
Yes.
Very diplomatic answer. I purchased mine from a tourofherown.com or .org. Is it .com? .org.
.com.
And so you can get it there too. You can buy it direct. But if you do take a trip to Washington, D.C., those local bookstores are a great place for souvenirs. People often ask, where can I get souvenirs? And the bookstores sometimes get overlooked because a book is not seen as a traditional snow globe bobblehead souvenir, but it can be just as good, if not better. So check out your local bookstores. Okay, I think I saw Jim had a hand raise. So you can go ahead and unmute and ask your question there, Jim.
I just wanted to say, directly across from the Xenon Hotel was the longtime headquarters for the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, where I worked, ardently an advocate of inclusion of people of all types. And of course, we dealt with women's issues. So I think it's somewhat appropriate that the Xenon is right there where the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights was located for many, many years.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. The location is definitely significant. It's not too far from the White House. It's just off the National Mall. You're kind of, surrounded by so many things. So that's good to know. Thanks, Jim. Thanks for coming today.
Okay, Carolyn has a question.
Yes. I love this book so much. I'm so glad you included the Temperance Fountain, which is my favorite weird memorial in DC. But I want to ask about the female Union Band cemetery. So I know you got to talk to the director, and that's incredible. I would love to hear a little bit more about how you did your research and some of the background, because I've walked those grounds, but there's like no interpretation there. Now I feel like it's finally getting press, largely thanks to you guys. So I would love to hear more about that part of the project.
Yeah, with the Female Union Band Society Cemetery, one of the first things that we did was get on the phone with the director, who's a woman named Lisa Fager, and is extremely accessible and very passionate. So if anybody does really want to have that like firsthand experience, don't hesitate to reach out. She's on Instagram under the account at Black Georgetown. So you can follow her over there. It started with a conversation or an interview, which to be honest with you, I think was like an hour or 2 hours, because once you get a bunch of historians together, we go down the rabbit hole. And she really delivered a lot of information to me. So that was just at that point, kind of sifting through what the highlights were, what really she brought attention to, and what I felt like connected to the theme of the book. I think to make note of the timing of when we wrote this book, and I would encourage everyone to read the foreword. This is a moment we are smack dab in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. And, tourism was really at a challenge, and people just across the whole world are trying to care for one another, right? And so for me, just this group of women who banded together for mutual aid was such a powerful story in the moment. They took care of each other in sickness. They had a constitution. And that's just like, not only were they just kind of like a group looking after for each other, but they were organized. And so that's where it started, from a spiritual, emotional place of connection. And then Lisa had sent me some really great PDF documents and records that the cemetery has. So I just kind of scanned through them, and that's where you see some of the specifics, like how much they were actually given and what was under that and whatnot, the logistics of how it all worked. But the cemetery is questionably has some challenges with the local Rock Creek Park. From a location perspective, it gets fed a lot of water, which makes the ground difficult to maintain. And there's a lot of controversy between the land, whose is it? There's a mention of eminent domain in the chapter. And that's something that still is happening today, and that they're trying to figure out. So this chapter is just full of information, and I really hope to organize a little trip out there where we can not only learn the history, but contribute to service projects in helping to keep and maintain and preserve the cemetery, because it needs a lot of help.
I definitely recommend, if you don't follow, particularly on Instagram at Black Georgetown, if you don't follow Lisa there, please do, especially if you're a local, if you're a Georgetown resident, if you're a tour guide. She shares a lot of really important, pertinent information to what's happening with the cemetery right now. And I think one of the beautiful elements of getting to work on this guidebook that I felt so fortunate for is so much of our work as tour guides is as historians, it's rooted in the past. And this guidebook really helped connect me to the present, what's happening in our city right now, what it's like for these sites, especially facing the pandemic and facing all the difficulties of the last 2 years, and not just in tourism, but in retail, hospitality, the restaurant and food industry. So getting a chance to talk about sites, not just as they were, but as they are right now and what's happening, was a real benefit of this book for me personally. And that's, I think, a perfect site for it. The history is amazing, but what's happening right now is really relevant and really important when we just talk about how does history get preserved and saved, and whose history gets preserved and saved. And Lisa is doing amazing work. So go out, follow her, support her, please.
We also, just to add a little behind the scenes look, when we went to go take photographs of, I think, the cemetery or even Dumbarton House next door, we just brought our lunch. We went to Call Your Mother Deli and brought bagels into the cemetery and just set up at the table and bench there. And, I was sure to ask, is this okay? And it is, it is the kind of place where you can kind of just bring your lunch, reflect, and of course, respect the grounds, be careful with your dogs and everything. But that was just a space where we all connected to have a meal together as well.
It's 12:58. I know we're coming up on the hour, and I don't want to speak for the authors. I can stay a little bit longer to hang out if people still have questions, if they are willing and able. So go ahead and raise your hand, either on Zoom or in real life, if you have one. And I'll just say, I agree about the temperance fountain. I was in New York City in September, and I was meeting up with someone, and they said, "Hey, meet me at this park." And I said, "Okay." And then I just stumbled upon a temperance fountain, and I said, "Oh my God, is this a Cogswell?" And the person who I was meeting, who was also a tour guide, a New York City tour guide, said, "What's a Cogswell?" And I thought, wow, now I get to teach. Mm-hmm. So that's why books like this are so great, is because you learn about these sites that people walk past 1,000 times and they have no idea that it's a thing. And then once they discover it, it's like you can't unsee it.
To me too, the temperance fountain is a great example of, on its face, it's not explicitly about women. It was the kind of result of a work of this man who was this leader in the movement. But you can't talk about the temperance movement without talking about women, because it's such a female forward movement. It's a movement where women were getting politically and civically engaged. And there's so many examples of that. If you're just going to list the places that explicitly talk about a woman, that list is going to be short. But we found 111 places to tell women's stories, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so many more places where women's stories can come alive if you know where to look, or you're willing to take the time to really say, how does this connect to women's place in our history?
Okay.
No other questions.
Any parting thoughts? Well, thank you to Kaitlin and Becca for allowing me to lead this conversation, talk to you about your book, for writing the book. I should start with thank you for writing the book. I'm really not into guidebooks anymore. I think that that's kind of an outdated concept, where you get the Frommers or the Lonely Planet. But I'm way into this type of book now, where it's, like I said, it's like a storybook, and you read 111 stories, and then you're visiting a place and you experience it, and it's like a totally different thing. So thank you for writing the book, and thank you for inviting me to join you for this.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks to everybody who joined us today, and everybody who's watching and listening to this after the fact. So thank you.
Thanks everyone for your support, and we hope to see you at the next TOHO event. Have a good day.